Hi, Misha. It's great to meet you at last.
Likewise, it's lovely to meet you, Yvonne.
Yeah, awesome. So, how have you been?
Hanging in there, doing as well as could possibly be asked at the tail end of 2020. This
Yes,
situation.
2020 majorly sucks, it has to be said.
True, true.
Yes, it's very true.
It's funny because at the same time, there have been so many wonderful things that have happened in my personal life that I frankly feel embarrassed to talk about because I know so many people who've had so much sadness and pain and loss.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
they're going,
it's
"Oh, I published a book.
strange contrasts. Yeah. Yes, I mean, I found it very weird. All these people saying, "Oh, I spent my lockdown finding myself and getting creative," and I'm like, I was working. So,
Mm.
yeah, sadly, also been in the lost somebody recently. So, and actually, a few people have passed on this year, and not all from COVID, thankfully. But yeah, it's been a hell of a ride.
It has, and
Yeah.
I'm desperately hoping that 2021 isn't going to play a game of hold my beer.
Yes, I really hope so. Yeah. Yes. So, yeah. So, one of the things that has been good is more people learning how to use Zoom and chatting online with
Absolutely.
actual video, which is great. So,
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I've actually been part of a couple of online pagan or witchy conferences, and that's been a delight. I actually got to attend a book club for some folks who'd read my book that was being held on the other side of the country, and it was marvelous. They were just like, "Oh yeah, we've got a special guest. Here's the author."
that's awesome. Yeah, fantastic.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah,
There's a
I know of a coven that's reading my book, which is nice. So,
oh, excellent.
but that hasn't happened yet. So, but
It's
that's
a fun.
awesome. I love it. Fantastic. So let's talk more about you. Um, so how long have you been involved in paganism, Wicca, and witchcraft, and the occult generally?
Oh, that stuff. That stuff. Um, I first ran across copies of Drawing Down the Moon and The Spiral Dance in the mid 80s. So it's been doing the math here 34, 35 years. Well, actually, about 33 or 34 years because a friend loaned me these two books when I had first moved to Greenville, South Carolina, of all places, to find witchcraft. Um, so yeah, little over 30 some odd years.
Yeah, actually, I remember you talking about that group in South Carolina in your book, which I very
Yeah.
much enjoyed.
Well, thank you.
Sounds like a fascinating group of people, actually.
They really were, science fiction fans and pagans and atheists and freethinkers and queer folks and just weirdos of every stripe who all just sort of clung together because they were surrounded by a sea of fundamentalist Christianity in the mid 1980s, which
Yeah. Yes, that's really interesting because I met I thankfully wasn't surrounded by fundamentalist Christians, but I did have a similar formative experience. So, and actually, yeah, I think we've been involved in paganism around the same length of time. So, and my first pagan book was Rudyard Kipling's Puck of Pook's Hill,
oh, very
and my second pagan book was Starhawk's Dreaming the Dark. So,
wow, that the stretch from Kipling to Dreaming the Dark. I read Dreaming the Dark relatively early on because I read The Spiral Dance and just absolutely loved it and was like, I have to read everything by this person. And so, you know, I got that very sort of heady political witchcraft really early on. And there are probably some folks who would say, oh, that's why.
Yeah, they probably would, but we know better.
Right. Right.
I mean, the thing is, you know, were you drawn to Starhawk's work because those were your pre-existing ideas, or, you know, and then it's a positive
Right.
reinforcement loop, right?
Right. Right. And it's funny because I think that there are a lot of people who look back on that sort of 70s, 80s socially conscious witchcraft and go, oh, well, you know, that was sort of a thing back then that, you know, nobody really does anymore except like reclaiming people or whoever. But I didn't get the sense from it that it was, you know, particularly skewed in a political direction. Even though there was a lot of politics in there, obviously, I didn't come out of those books feeling like, oh, I have to go off and become an activist now.
No, me
Because,
neither.
yeah, I was reading them because they were books on witchcraft. And there absolutely is witchcraft in those books, which I think some people overlook sometimes, which is a bit strange, but
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think the reason I got into active witchcraft as opposed to sort of generic paganism was because I looked at sort of the state of politics and thought, right, okay, the way we're going to change the world is by changing our own consciousness one at a time. So
yeah,
that's the obvious place to start, and so that's kind of my ground zero reason for being into the craft. So
absolutely. It's funny because I've occasionally run across people who, um, in offering me critiques of my writing, will say things like, "You spend all this time focusing on power and power dynamics, and that's not got anything to do with witchcraft or paganism." And I'm going, uh, what?
yeah, like, huh?
You really just said that power has nothing to do with witchcraft. You said that with your mouth or with your fingers on a keyboard, and you didn't think about that sentence first? Okay, okay, cool.
Like, you
We
get
need,
two people in a room and you've got group dynamics, right? You get three people in the room and you've got an exponential,
right.
you know, you've got group dynamics cubed. So
The notion that, you know, power isn't part of the fundamental uh, isness of witchcraft, that it isn't, you know, fundamentally a part of the conversation from the get-go, is baffling to me. But I suppose I grew up in and was trained in a very different kind of witchcraft from some folks.
yeah,
I, you know, I know that you and I share a bit of background in that we're both, you know, under that Gardnerian umbrella. Um,
very one of the same struts of the Gardnerian umbrella.
Indeed. But my initial exposure to anything sort of structured or traditional as far as witchcraft goes was an American eclectic tradition that I sort of kind of was training in for a little while. And then that whole situation sort of disintegrated and fell apart. And then I was, you know, a solitary eclectic for a very long time. And then I wound up training in and eventually initiating into a British tradition of Wicca called Kingstone.
Ah, yes,
Yeah, part of the Central Valley Wicca.
I am familiar with it. Yep.
And that's where I kind of came into, you know, the more known traditions of the craft. And then from there was sort of adopted into Whitecroft Gardnerian. And a few years later, after kind of dancing around it for a while, eventually started studying and then becoming an initiate of the Anderson fairy tradition, which is, and sort of looking at the three of those things, you have sort of a little triangulation on what the basis, like sort of the fundamental basis of my practice of the craft is like. You know, there's a lot of kind of Gardnerian, Kingstone, Brit trad elements, but there's also all of this wild stuff and wonderful stuff from fairy and everything else shiny that I've picked up along the way and didn't put down.
Yeah, it sounds pretty similar to my practice, to be honest. Yeah. Although rather than the fairy bit, my extra thing is a bit of Cochrane that got mixed in along the way.
Oh, excellent. Excellent.
Yes.
I have a few friends who went the Cochrane or 1734 route, and it's always fun talking with them about stuff. You know, we sort of, you know, like we'll have the shared language of British traditional Wicca, but then they've got some of the Cochrane stuff and I've got the Anderson fairy stuff, and we sort of, you know, dance around a little. It's fun. It's good times.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't be full-time Cochrane stuff because I don't get riddles. And there's an awful lot of riddles involved. I've just got a complete tin ear for riddles. So I'm just like, yeah, that's amazing. No idea what the answer is.
What? Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, it's funny because people will say, "Well, you're Gardnerian," and I'm like, "Yes, and." Well, I thought you were fairy. Well, yes, I am. It's like I am all of these things.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that my practice, you know, when my partner and I come down here to our temple space that we're in right now, which is also
Nice
where
temple.
is. Thank you. It's actually it's in a bit of a state right now because we're sort of in transition, moving things around. So what you can see looks really nice. Everything behind the camera, bit of a dog's breakfast, but but when my partner and I are working together, I would say that the structure looks a little more like the particular line of fairy that I come from, with some British traditional Wiccan flavor folded in, because, you know, that's so much of my background. How could it not be?
Yeah.
But fairy is also wonderfully inclusive and forgiving in that regard. And it's just like, oh, you have a background in Thelema. You have a background in, you know, Brit trad Wicca. You have a background in Druidry or what have you. Great. Let's throw it all into a pot.
Awesome. Why not?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's fantastic. So of your various traditions, would you, I mean, obviously Anderson Fairy is very accommodating of queer identity, and I love the fact that the central mystery of it is ecstasy kind of thing. But how would you say it, that those traditions, sorry, so actually before we get onto that, I was going to ask you about your queer identity and how you would describe that.
Absolutely. So I am a non-binary transgender person. The pronouns that I use are they, them, their, theirs. I'm multiple varieties of queer. I generally sort of shorthand it by saying I'm bi or pan or somewhere in that general range of things, bisexual or pansexual. I unfortunately have lost my taste for a lot of the discourse, drawing bright lines between this is bisexuality and this is pansexuality and never the twain shall meet. You know, I'm sort of over here going, that seems like a lot of arguing. And
yeah. I mean, I've always identified as bisexual because that was the term that was available back in the day when I
Absolutely.
first came out. And then suddenly somebody invented pansexual and started redefining bisexual in the process. And I'm like, well, I suppose by the definition of pansexual, I'm probably pansexual, but my identity is bisexual. So yeah.
Right.
So, and I'm non-binary as well. So,
Right.
So yeah, like I think it's very difficult to kind of draw a hard, bright line, as you rightly say.
Right.
So yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, no. So of your various traditions, which one would you say that they were inclusive or affirming of your queerness, or did you have to kind of boot a few people up the backside?
So there are a couple of answers to this question. The sort of the academic textbook answer is that pretty much by definition, fairy would easily be the most inclusive and incorporating of queerness of gender and queerness of sexuality. And I want to call those out as two separate things. They are related for a great many people, but they are, they are very much their own things.
Yeah.
And fairy is queer as the day is long. I mean, our gods are queer, our practice is queer, and there's just never been any kind of problem with it. You look at the writings that Victor and Cora Anderson, the grand masters of the tradition, the writings that they left behind, and they were just so completely accepting of gender queerness and sexuality queerness. They're just like, it was never a question for them, but that the gods, pardon me, that the gods welcomed and cherished all acts of love and pleasure, if you will. And by contrast, Wicca, speaking specifically of the traditional forms of Wicca, is largely built on a binary gender structure, which makes a lot of things harder for some people to access. Not, I think, intrinsically, but because of the structures that are built around those ideas. And that's where we get to the second answer, which is that I've met fairy who, very few, admittedly, but I've met fairy who were a little homophobic or a little transphobic. And I know Gardnerians and Kingstone who are queer, who are trans, who are straight and cisgender, but profoundly, deeply accepting of queer and trans people. I remember the first conversation that I had with a Gardnerian priest after re-engaging with the community a few years back, and saying basically, well, like, how do you all feel about queer people, about trans people? And he was just like, are you kidding? I love queer people. I love trans people. We have some in our coven spaces, in our circles, and we work with them all the time, and they're great. And anybody who has a problem with them is just being stupid. And I went, wow, that was not the answer I expected. Because I'd had some experience of having conversations about queerness with people in the traditional Wiccan community, and the answers always tended toward, well, people can do whatever they want, but I don't know that we're really the best tradition for them.
Yeah. I mean, I think that over the years, I mean, all the Wiccan events I've been to, there's always been like a queer lunch or a queer workshop, or so there's always that queer space where people get together and do stuff. And over the years, that sort of started to permeate into other areas of events. But I mean, I still see too many heterocentric rituals at public events, right, or large events. But I mean, things are so much better than they were. You know, when we started having these conversations, there were people who didn't know what cis or trans meant and had to have it explained to them.
Right, and now people will know what cis means, but they'll think it's a slur, and you just no,
Yeah.
It literally means on the same side of. Trans
Yeah, like
means,
cis-alpine and trans-alpine, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
I spent some time in cis-alpine Gaul recently, and so there you go.
Well, and that is the example that I use when I'm explaining it to people.
Yeah. Well, funnily enough, the people of cis-alpine Gaul have absolutely no problem with the concept of cisgender because they know what cis means.
Right. No, we get it. We know the word. It's fine. It's fine.
Yes. Like, they weren't sure how to translate it into Italian, but they didn't have a problem with it.
Sure. Well, I wrote the whole passage in Outside the Charmed Circle explaining and defining the term, not because the world needed one more explanation of cis versus trans, but because I didn't want a reader to run across this term and go, wait, is this some strange thing that I'm supposed to know? And no, it's not. It's not a strange thing that you're supposed to know. Here, let me just make this real simple and straightforward. It's fine. It's okay.
Yeah. Well, I really loved the way that you explained all your terms really carefully and laid it all out, because I think, I mean, it was funny that you said in your review that that had you read my book first, you might not have written yours. And I was like, no, your book is so great. Like, it's really, really good. And I'm, you know, if that would have been the outcome, I'm very glad you didn't, because I think it's really good. And I think that they actually would dovetail together really nicely, because you've kind of carefully explained all the terms and I've just charged ahead going, yeah, people know what this stuff means by now. I have got a glossary on my website, but yeah, I think they would just dovetail together really, really nicely as a.
Absolutely. It's funny, when I was first writing, well, not when I was first writing the book, when I had first turned in my initial draft, I had a conversation with my editor, Heather Green at Llewellyn, who
is a very fine person. Yes.
She's a delightful human being. I love her to pieces. And so we're on the phone and she asked me, who is your audience for this book? And I kind of wibbled a bit about, well, you know, I want it to be kind of two audiences. I'd really like to reach out to the sort of straight cis people who don't really understand all the queer stuff, but I also really want to write a book that little 15-year-old baby witch Misha wanted to read back in the day. And Heather said, yeah, write that book.
Yeah.
Yeah, write that book, and the other folks who need to get this stuff will get it from that book. And I was a little taken aback and went, oh, okay, let's do it.
Yeah. And, you know, it's really clear, and I'm glad she didn't entirely wrest the snark hammer from your hands, because I was very fond of that snark hammer. So
thank you so much. She very wisely, I feel, got me to tone it down a little. The other story that I'm very fond of relating from that first phone call I had with her was in the first draft of the book. We were going over a few things, and she said, now, Misha, you can't call Aleister Crowley a jerk face. And I said, but Heather, in the original draft, I called him an asshole. burst out laughing, and I just relaxed, was like, oh, thank God. Okay, we're going to be able to get on just fine.
That's hilarious. Yeah, I did kind of gather that you weren't a fan.
You know, it's funny because people have tried to take me to task for kind of taking the piss with Crowley a bit. Um, I think that he contributed a phenomenal amount to Western occultism and modern paganism. I don't know that that was all a good thing. And I would actually make an argument that some of his contributions have become obstacles that we have to get past.
Mm,
But he was clearly an intelligent person. He was clearly someone who did a lot of the work, which you can, you know, see in the records he left behind. And sometimes you read those records and it's like, why would you do that?
yeah.
But
Well, I actually have a unique insight
oh,
into why he would do half the stuff that he did,
mhm,
which is that he was brought up in the Plymouth Brethren.
yes.
Uh, he was brought up in the slightly less extreme form of the Plymouth Brethren. I was brought up in the most extreme form
Oh.
until the age of 9. So when he does complete off the rails asshole stuff, I'm like, yeah, I can relate.
Oh, oh,
I mean,
that's
there are some things he did that make me extremely angry, like the time that he sacrificed a cat, because I really like cats and I'm deeply horrified by that. Um, but you know, I know what it. I know. I understand his urge to kick over the traces in a general way.
you can relate. Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense. That does.
Yes,
Uh,
I did once throw one of his books across the room because it made me so angry as
uh,
well.
that's fair. That's fair. You know, there are any number. There was a period of a few years where I managed to amass quite a sizable Crowley library, and you know, read my way through a chunk of it, and kind of came out the other side going, okay, I think I have a sense of what's going on and what he's about, and I'm good. I'm
Yeah,
good. Yeah. The you know, this is great. He's got a thing. It worked for him to whatever extent it did, and that's arguable, I think. There are certainly plenty of people today who find his work an inspiration, and I would never presume to say, oh, that's all, it's all rubbish.
mm.
Um,
He wrote a very good piece about invocation, which I still refer people to this day. Um, but yes, I think he was extremely unkind to Victor Neuberger. So
yes.
um,
And Raoul Loveday
yeah,
and any number of his various Scarlet Women.
yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
but
I'm
so I do admit to taking a certain degree of pleasure in poking the idol that is Crowley.
absolutely yes. I think people should give Jack Parsons a bit more love as well. Actually,
I really like a lot of Parsons' writing. In Freedom is a Two-Edged Sword, his piece about the witchcraft.
yes,
I
I love that piece.
Yeah. I found that really exciting and inspirational to read. And, you know, would that he had not blown himself to pieces in a garage.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it'd be amazing to see what else he would have written.
Right. Absolutely.
Definitely. So, uh, so you've talked a bit about the origin, the editing process of Outside the Charm Circle.
Yes.
What was the impetus behind writing it, would you say?
Um, so, uh, as we said, I've been knocking around the pagan, polytheist, occult communities for 30 years and change. And round about 2009, 2010, I took a sabbatical from, if you'll pardon the pun, from all of it, from everything, and just walked away to sort of focus on my mundane life
Mm.
and focus on, in a lot of ways, my own emotional well-being. There were a lot of things going on in my personal life that needed sorted, and I just was like, I'm going to put all of these things in a box and put the box in the closet and focus on, having a job, having a partner, having a relationship, just, you know, doing the sort of mundane things. And if I feel the pull to come back to this, I will come back to it, but I need some space.
Mm.
And uh, during that time, I realized that I really wanted to go back to school. And my partner said, "Hey, if you want to do this, we can make that happen." So I went to university and wound up getting a degree from the University of Washington in 2017 in gender, women, and sexuality studies. um, During this period of time, I started feeling that call to, go pull out the box of tricks and start re-engaging with my practice in some useful, spiritually satisfying kind of way. And so I did. And that, the working of magic, the witchcraft, the spiritual practice kind of lived over here, and then all of my academic work lived over here. And then I started drawing little connections between them as I was going through my courses. And then there came a point when I was writing a piece intended to be a submission for an anthology. As it turns out, it was turned down, which was fine, um, but I remember looking at that piece and thinking, I'm going to do something with this at some point. And it wound up becoming my writing sample when I submitted to become a writer for the Pathos Pagan channel, with Jason Mankey as my channel editor. Jason, who I adore, was basically like, "Oh, you write?" And I said, "Yeah, well, here's a writing sample." And Jason replied with a contract, said, "This is great. I love this. What do you think you'd want to cover as far as, like what kind of thing do you want to write about?" And until that moment, I hadn't really grasped this, but I realized I want to write about the intersection of all of the stuff that I've been studying with all of the magic that I've been doing, all of the spiritual practice, the mythology, the cosmology, the theology, and the day-to-day culture of these spiritual communities. What happens when we look at the modern pagan movement through a lens informed by modern feminist theory, by queer theory?
Mm.
What happens when we start looking at our traditions through those lenses? And that became the blog. And over the course of time, I started writing pieces that were longer and longer. I started writing multi-part pieces. And John Beckett at one point said, in response to some comment that I made kind of complaining about how increasingly wordy I was getting, he said, "If you've got a blog post that's much more over 1,200 words, you're writing something, but it's not a blog post." And I think that was the point where I went, "Oh no." And that is how the book Outside the Charmed Circle began.
I see. Well, that's a good start. I mean, you know, a lot of my blog posts get turned into book chapters, so or
Yeah.
bits of book chapters. So
No, I've told people who've read the blog, like, yeah, if you pick up the book, there will be passages that sound hauntingly familiar.
yeah, nothing
I
wrong
mean,
with that.
yeah, I do try to, amplify on them some, because I don't want people feeling like they just bought a greatest hits compilation. I try to, add a couple of, brand new studio songs to the end.
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that, one of the things that makes you want to buy the book as opposed to reading the blog is that you get all the ideas in a nice, neat,
Right.
like sequence with, rather than, reading the sequel before you read the prequel sort of effect.
Yeah, one of the things that I had the most fun, and by which I mean the hardest time, trying to establish in writing Outside the Charmed Circle was creating a clear through line, because it existed in my head, because all of these things were connected, and I just wanted to be like, well, it's there, the connection's right there. Just no, you have to actually use your words.
I thought you did a very good job of establishing continuity, because something I struggle with as well. And it's like, well, I know what I mean, but like, will anyone else? Yeah. So yeah, it is tricky. Yeah.
It is. And I figure, where I can't establish a clear through line, I can always make a pop culture joke, and people will be too busy laughing to notice that, do they know what they're going on about? I don't know, but they said something funny about Van Halen. Keep going.
Yeah. It worked for me. I really enjoyed it, and I owe you a review, so that's it's coming up. But yeah, it was really good, very enjoyable. So other than your own book, obviously, what would you say is your favorite book on, and you can have more than one because it's sometimes hard to pick, favorite book on queer paganism / Wicca / witchcraft?
This is one of those questions that's really easy to give about 17 answers to. I not to be kissing up to the host here, but I love All Acts of Love and Pleasure, inclusive Wicca. I recommend it in my book because I feel like it's an incredibly important book and just an amazing service that you've done to the Wiccan community, to the pagan community, getting those ideas out there in the world. And
Thank you.
absolutely. And I tell people who are like, oh, there's never been a book like yours before. I'm like, oh, no. Look in the references section in the back of my book. I am standing on other people's shoulders. Look at Yvonne's book, look at Brandy Williams's book. There are other books out there that are having this conversation. Mine is not, my book isn't intended to be an innovation or to be breaking new ground. It's intended to be my contribution to this ongoing conversation that, I mean, we've all been having for decades in letters, going back to Arthur Evans's Witchcraft and the Gay Counterculture.
Yeah.
But apart from yours, I would say, while it is not explicitly a book about queerness and magic, I would say this is a book that is absolutely informed and influenced and shaped by queerness, and that is Manon Hedenborg White's The Eloquent Blood, which is her doctoral thesis published through Oxford University Press, all about the goddess Babylon. Mr. Crowley's, well, before Crowley, but probably best known by way of Crowley and Thelema. It is an absolute Words are failing me clearly. This is the kind of book that people use the term tour de force about
Mm.
unapologetically and unironically. Um, I When I wrote a review of it for the blog, I said that I felt it was the most important book on the subject of esoteric spirituality to have been published since Ronald Hutton's Triumph of the Moon.
Wow, that's high praise indeed.
And yeah, and there were people who responded to that review going, wow, really? I mean, this doctoral thesis about a fairly obscure goddess, about one fairly obscure goddess? That you're saying that's the most important book since? And yes, I am. Because she was writing about this figure both in the context of spiritual practice that happened back in the day, in the 40s and 50s, so we're talking about Crowley and Jack Parsons and Marjorie Cameron Parsons and all of these other folks, but also looking at the practice of Babylon worship today, now with modern practitioners. I have friends who are quoted in the book. It's a very delightful thing. And in a way, the book kind of harkens back to a little bit of the sort of ethnographical style in something like Drawing Down the Moon, Margot Adler's book, which I still to this day adore.
It's a great book.
Oh, it is. It is. But Manon Hedenborg White really wrote about this community, this group of people, with a profound sympathy, and really looked at the ways in which this goddess, and I mean, make no mistake, Babylon is very much a queer goddess, informed and influenced their lives.
Wow.
And, really kind of feeding back to the idea of Babylon as a goddess who is queer precisely because she refuses no one. She accepts all, she brings all into herself. And, through being the servant of all, becomes the master of all, the mistress of all.
Like it.
Yeah, it's a fascinating book. And it's one that I wish more people knew about and were reading.
Yeah, it sounds awesome. I definitely added to my to-read list. So yeah, I think it's so important as well to have that sympathetic, the sympathy with the community that you're writing about. I mean, I was immediately thinking by contrast about Persuasions of the Witch's Craft, which in many ways is a fascinating book, but it's clear that she is not in sympathy with the people she's writing about. And, her starting premise was that, how can these people get into something so silly? And that's not a respect, it's just not a neutral stance at all. So, to have an ethnographer who is writing from the standpoint of sympathy with the community they're writing about is just super important.
Yeah, I actually saw Manon Hedenborg White give a presentation at the Texts and Traditions Colloquium here in Seattle, back when we were able to do things like go out in public and see people. And so I think it was September 20, it was September 2019. And she gave this presentation that was in large part drawn from her book. And, as I said, anything Crowleyan or Thelemic, I'm a little like, okay, let's see what's going on here. I'm a little, and I went in with my partner, who is even less taken with Crowley than I am. And literally by the end of her talk, when she got to the question and answer session, I had my phone out. My partner leaned over to me and she was like, "We're getting this book." And I showed her on my phone. I had the Oxford University Press site up on my phone. I was like, "I'm buying it right now."
That does sound very good. Yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty spectacular. And yeah, it's one of the things that I think is really interesting about 2020 from a pagan, polytheist, occultist perspective, when you're looking at the culture of these movements, is that we're reaching a we're reaching a place of notability in the context of the mainstream overculture, enough such that when you say Wicca to the average person on the street, they have some idea of what that means. I mean, their
Yes.
idea could be completely wrong, but they have some sense of, oh, okay, that's like that witchcraft stuff, right?
Yes.
Or yeah, or if you tell people, oh, I'm a practicing witch, they say, oh, so that's like Wicca, right? And sometimes, yeah, and sometimes it's like, well, not exactly, but you find yourself in the position of trying to explain the weird sectarian divides in the modern pagan movement, and most people just aren't going to care.
Yeah,
And
this is very true. I mean, the problem is that, like earlier on, I was on Twitter and somebody had commented about how they'd had a transphobic remark from a coven that they met. And actually the person in question was a she, so I will use she. And she said that, so I immediately said, well, when was this? And who were these people? Like, anyway, it turned out they were Dianic. So I was like, yeah, well, go figure. And she also said that she knows lots of other Wiccans who are very trans inclusive, so it was all fine. But I wasn't surprised. And then I said, well, not even all Dianics, because there's McFarland Dianic Wicca, which is explicitly inclusive. So yeah, I mean, but that's the thing. And then there were lots of people commenting on this thread that were all saying, oh yes, well, the occult community, blah blah blah. And I'm like, can we just get a bit more nuance here, please?
right. I mean, that's like saying, the Christian community.
Yeah.
Well,
Which
okay.
Christians?
Yeah, the Christian community covers everybody from the Westboro Baptist Church to the local Episcopal church, the local Anglican church out here with the giant rainbow banner out front that says "Love is love."
Yeah.
Right, the one that says "Black Lives Matter."
Yeah, exactly, like chalk and cheese.
Right. You reach a certain point where it becomes nonsensical to say these two things are part of the same spiritual tradition. And yet, if you look at it on paper, okay, are they Trinitarian? They use the same book, more or less, adjusting for translation value. Yeah, you're part of the same thing.
Yeah, nominally. But
right.
you can derive such wildly different perspectives from reading the Bible. It's like, might as well be reading a different book.
But you read black, or I read white. Yeah.
Same applies to, my argument is there's more than one Book of Shadows. There's for every witch, there's at least one Book of Shadows.
Right.
But,
well, and it's especially funny looking at those arguments, being an initiate of two traditions that have explicit canonical books of shadows, and then fairy, which is that's I mean,
yeah. Well, the thing is that I happen to know that there is a Kingstone Book of Shadows, and there's a and then there's the Whitecroft Book of Shadows, which is and actually there are multiple Whitecroft Books of Shadows. There's not just one. And then there's other, there's the Long Island Book of Shadows, and the this and the that and the other thing. And each coven tends to have like a different Book of Shadows, and then there's like somebody I know has a collection of scanned PDFs of the different Books of Shadows for different Gardnerian covens back in the day. So all with some fairly substantial differences in them. So
what's that Kipling line? There are 99 ways of constructing tribal lays, and every single one of them is right.
absolutely. Or to quote Hermann Hesse, let a thousand flowers bloom.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Another formative influence on me, Hermann Hesse.
My partner has all of Hesse's work. She is. It's through her that I know anything at all about Hesse. So I always like to, pay homage where homage is due.
That is good. That is good. Yes.
But yeah. But yeah, coming back to the queerness thing, because for me everything does come back to queerness. I know that there are still folks who have a hard time with understanding how trans people can possibly fit into this or that tradition. There are people who are still grappling with understanding how gay people could fit into this or that tradition. And, as against that, I remember chatting with Jason Mankey at some point. We were just hanging out having drinks, and I made some comment about, there being homophobia and transphobia in the Gardnerian community, in the traditional Gardnerian community. And Jason's response, I remember this to this day, he's just like, well, that's just stupid. I mean, if we kicked out all the gay and lesbian and trans and everything people from Gardnerian craft, there'd be like 12 people left.
Yep. This is very true.
And it's
I think the thing that makes my brain hurt is when you get somebody who is all the things, like they are genderqueer and non-binary and polyamorous and
they're half the colors of the rainbow already,
and all of the things, right? And then they go, yes, but Wicca is a binary tradition, and it's all about the gender binary. And I'm like, what? Like, I just don't understand how you can be all the things and still insist that it is this gender binary thing. And I'm like, because I was very fortunate that in the coven that I was originally initiated into, we didn't really bother with any of that shit. It wasn't a big deal. And everyone in my immediate lineage happens to be bisexual anyway. So it's like, yeah, we don't care.
I think that a lot of people conflate polarity and binary gender essentialism.
Yes, they do. And that's what I've been trying to pull them apart for ages.
Right. So there's a presentation that I've done based on the book where I basically spend the first 15 minutes doing a crash course in gender and sexuality studies for pagans.
Yep, I've done that too.
Yeah. So, you wind up like, okay, we're going to define all the terms we're using here, and let me explain why it's important that we understand what these terms mean. And we're going to talk about gender and, gender identity, gender expression, gender, attribution, and, sex assigned.
Yeah. I actually ended up stopping doing that introductory thing for my talks, because everybody who showed up to my talks was LGBTQIA and already knew all the things. And I mean, I was still like, there was this talk I gave in 2014, and there was this guy who asked the question, well, what about all these people who call themselves they then? And I'm like, you're in a room full of people who
The call
probably
is
call themselves they. Like,
outside the
what's your
house.
problem?
Right. I yeah, one of the things that I found useful to do when I'm doing that presentation, when I'm doing those presentations where I'm trying to explain how polarity isn't an on-off switch.
It's one of the first things my high priestess told me, that it's a spectrum.
Right.
And that's the difference between polarity and duality, that,
Right.
you know, polarity is two ends of a spectrum and duality is two separate things.
Space in between and around and above and below, and it's
Yes.
multidimensional. So when I do these presentations, I have my little PowerPoint because I love drawing pictures in the air, and PowerPoint gives me the ability to do that and make them look good. So, you know, I'll have the little PowerPoint thing come up where it's like, okay, here's, you know, a female symbol and a male symbol, and one of them's black and one of them's white. And then there's a little bar that appears behind them, and, you know, one of them is white behind the black symbol and the other half is black behind the white symbol. It's very binary, very, you know, opposite ends of the magnet. And I'm like, okay, but here's the thing. That's not actually how gender works. Gender works more like this. And then I click the next thing, and the little black and white bar disappears, and it's instead a rainbow sphere that the male and female symbols are at either end of. And then, you know, you click the next thing, and a bunch of little trans symbols appear, kind of sprinkled all through it like stars. And, you know, an agender symbol that appears outside the sphere completely. It's just like, I'm good, thanks.
I like that. That's neat. Yeah, I mean, my go-to metaphor these days is gender is a landscape.
Yeah.
Like, you know, there's little cisgender on the world, and like, you know, Saint Boy up in the mountains, and then there's the Otter River, and
Right. No, I love that.
yeah.
Ladyston on the moor.
Yes, and then there's a little turfy island that's off the mainland, and in between there's the Straits of Bigotry.
Nice.
I think my friend Drew Marland, who drew the map of this landscape, may have been the one to come up with the Straits of Bigotry.
I was so hoping you were going to say there was a map.
There is a map.
Fantastic. Yes. I would love to see that.
Yes, it's on my blog. If you look at the landscape of gender,
I will look for it.
With the beautiful map by the lovely Drew Marland.
Excellent.
Who is a very talented artist. So yes.
Yeah, like the visualizations. I love giving people something concrete to hang these ideas on. So yeah, you know, the sort of gender spectrum sphere thing, I, you know, hand that to people and I'm like, here, maybe this will help. And it's amazing how when you give someone a concrete image, you can see the light go on. They're like, oh, okay. I kind of understand a little better. I'm like way over here, but this person's a little more kind of in the middle, maybe up here somewhere.
Yeah. I mean, I love the fact that it's a sphere, because then you can be, you know, you can be on the dark side, the undiscovered side, right. Be on the dark side of the moon.
Absolutely.
So the people with xenogenders can be in there too.
Right. Absolutely. My daughter asked me at some point recently, she's 14 and she has a number of friends who are exploring, you know, sort of neo-pronouns and xenogender, and she wanted to know what I thought of that because she knows that's what I went to school for. And I said, oh, I think it's brilliant. And she went, really? And I said, yeah, I think the increasing granularity that we are able to bring to express our experiences of gender, of sexuality, of desire, of experience is fantastic because it reflects an increasing ability and willingness to put those experiences into words and communicate them to other people.
Yes, yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I recently read Felix Ever After by Case and Callender, which is a young adult book about a young trans man who the book starts after he's had a partial transition, and then he's going through various things, and there's a love affair, and it's all very lovely. And then at some point he actually settles on a, I'm trying to do no spoilers here, right? So, but at some point he actually settles on a slight variation on the original gender identity, and I was like, that's really good. And now I get that gender identity, and now it makes more sense to me. So, and I actually kind of thought, you know, that's probably what mine is as well. So, yeah, it's a very good book, and just the thing for teenagers who are looking, you know, if people are looking for something to get their teenager for birthday gifts, it's just the thing. So
I will be looking that up. Thank you.
Yeah, it's really good. Yeah. I think neopronouns and xenogenders and stuff are like, you know, why not? It's really helpful. And if I think if people can find their own name for their own gender, then that's totally fine and great, and more power to their elbow. And
my only reservation is less about neopronouns or xenogenders than it is about being willing to have patience with people acting in good faith who may not be able to immediately adapt to a pronoun they've literally never heard before 30 seconds ago.
Yes. Well, and also, if you're going to have grammar nerd here, if you're going to have a neopronoun, then I want to know the dative, the genitive, and the transitive and the intransitive forms of it.
Right.
And the possessive, I want to know all of that, because I need to know how to use it in a sentence.
And yeah, absolutely. I have at best an intuitive grasp of grammar, which, mostly derives from having spent all of the time in school when I should have been learning grammar. Well, honestly, probably reading Tolkien.
Yeah.
So
that'll teach you a lot of grammar, though. It probably teaches you how to decline the verb forms with thee and thou.
Right, but it teaches me the grammar of an early 20th century philologist. It, winds up making my sentence constructions a little more Byzantine than they perhaps. Yeah. But yeah, and really, like, my pleas for patience really just come from the same place as honestly everything in the book, which is all I ever want is for people to understand one another.
Yes.
Yeah. So, it's like I wrote this book because I wrote it for a lot of reasons, not least of which being that I had all of these ideas in my head that I wanted to stop yammering about to people over pints at events, and instead just put in a book and be like, okay, here's the ideas, go read them there. Now I'm going to...
I completely get that motivation. Yes.
Right. Yeah. It's like, I really just want to, hang out and talk about Babylon 5 or whatever.
Yay, Babylon 5.
Oh, yes. But I remember being at PantheaCon a few years back, and my partner was chatting with an older woman who found in my partner clearly someone who she read as sympathetic, and so she really wanted to kind of quiz my sweetie about you know, all of the queer and trans stuff, and like, you know, people's pronouns and the they them thing. And she just like, and you know, what it came down to was she was a person of good intent. She just didn't get it,
Yeah.
didn't understand, and she didn't ever want to hurt anybody. She didn't want to be insensitive or rude or dismissive. She just didn't understand.
Yeah. And that's
Yeah,
completely okay. Like, it's people's intentions that are the most important thing. And but yeah, I think it's when people do it 20 times over and absolutely refuse to make an effort that
yeah,
that's when it gets annoying.
yeah.
Like,
Where I sort of default is, you know, when people want to play the "that's not grammatical" card is, look, if it was good enough for Geoffrey Chaucer and Jane Austen, you
exactly.
get on board.
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
those,
Yeah, and actually it was 18th and 19th century uh, so-called grammarians who decided that singular they was ungrammatical, and they had to kind of spend ages persuading people not to say it when actually it was already part of the language. So
I'm just saying Jane Austen is a better writer than any of the people I've seen agitating against singular they, and
absolutely, yes. What?
well, and it sort of underscores the extent to which identity is weaponized against queer people,
Yes.
down to the very language that we use to express ourselves and our experiences. You know, I use they them pronouns and have seen myself being critiqued in various places as, you know, this person, because you know, folks will want to apply a masculine pronoun to me, but they'll know that that immediately brands them as being the asshole.
Yeah.
And so they will just not refer to me with any pronoun. They will just refer to this person.
Yeah, that's so rude. I mean,
These are folks who want to make an ideological point.
mm,
And their ideological point is that they're not buying into
all
that,
that
you
stuff. Yeah.
all that gender woo woo is what a lot of them call it. And I, there's a point at which I look at them and realize they're no different from Trump supporters. They are waving their defiance around like a banner
Mm.
and making themselves look a fool.
Yeah. Well, they're on the same page as climate science deniers and
Right.
mask refusers,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
Pretty
All of
much.
those folks who are, you know, the reason why we're still holding up at the end of 2020.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
I say, as someone who had to cancel multiple promotional appearances for a book because
Yeah.
there's a pandemic and, you know, no one could be arsed to wear a mask.
Yeah.
Well, no one. Just a significant enough number of people.
Oh, particularly bad around your neck of the woods. Yes.
Well, the funny thing is, Washington State is actually doing quite well. Uh, you know, things were really bad here for a while. We got outpaced very early on.
Mm.
And I, you know, I would say that's a race I'm happy to lose, but honestly, I don't want anyone to win it. So
Yeah. No, I mean, it's horrifying. And,
it is.
here in Ontario, we haven't got too many anti-mask people. There's some, but we have more cases than we should have. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a bad scene.
Mm.
That's
So,
no
yeah.
fun. That's no fun to talk about.
No, we had to mention COVID sometime, right? But
Yeah.
anyway, yay, there's a vaccine when we eventually
Yay.
all get it. So that's
You're
good.
cooking.
So,
Yes.
conscious of the time,
Yes.
we just have time for you to tell us about your furry friend behind you.
Oh, this furry friend. Haha. This is my little plushy Baphomet. They are articulated. Um,
Ooh.
they have, the little star, and as you can see, there's one blue eye and there's one green eye. The legs and the arms and the legs are both articulated, so we can, have a seated or a standing walking, and wings on the back, of
Oh,
course.
very good.
This was created by an artist in Japan who does work under the name Quiet Alertness. And she makes a number of these sort of terrifyingly demonic looking goats, some with like animal print patterns and, 8 eyes on the head.
Wow.
And they're delightful. Uh, but I reached out to her and said, hey, would you be able to do one of these in black? And she said, absolutely. What color eyes do you want? I said, can you do one blue and one green? And she said, oh, an odd eye goat. I love that. Yes. And a few
David
months,
Bowie Baphomet.
exactly. Thank you. Yes. And a few months later,
There he is.
little Daffy turned up on the doorstep.
That's
And
perfectly
I,
splendid.
yeah, I showed them to my partner and she loved it. And then I, articulated the legs and made the Baphomet walk toward her on the couch. And she went, no, you have to stop that now.
Yes. I just realized I just used the wrong pronoun for Baphomet. But for me, all cuddly toys, regardless, are all he for some reason. I don't know why.
I get that, but we have
But-
several around here. This is the Plague Doctor from
Ah,
Squish.
I have a burb like that as well, but it's not the same as that one exactly. But it's got a very similar beak.
Yeah. Yeah, they Squishables put out a Plague Doctor, and my partner and I immediately realized we had to get it.
Yes. Well, we have a Morris side, which is currently somewhat dormant because of the pandemic, but
Yeah.
I had to get a Plague Doctor burb as our Morris side mascot. So
Oh, very nice. Very nice. And then there's the Bast and the Anubis.
oh, very good.
Yep, they actually live on our ancestor altar most of the time, because that seems right and proper, and because we are very serious witches.
Very good. Yes.
Very
Well,
nice.
I always really liked the chapter in Janet and Stuart Farrar's book about teddy bears and how teddy bears are clearly sort of some kind of domestic spirit. I think it's great.
Absolutely.
So yes, perfectly witchy, perfectly good.
Oh yeah, yeah. And
Yes,
Daffy
perfectly
around.
splendid.
Yep.
So have you got any other books in the pipeline, or having a rest?
I have some stuff I'm working on right now that will, Deus Volent, see the light of day, at some point. I just had a couple of pieces published in the Witch's Almanac,
Ah, yes.
the upcoming one with the sun on it. I got to write a piece about the queerness of witch gods, and a piece about rethinking polarity and the whole knife and cup thing.
Excellent. Yes.
Those were a lot of fun to write, and I sent them into the editor, and he was like, "These are great. Yes, I'll have them." And I went, "Cool. Let's hope
Excellent.
we don't
Yes.
too many people."
Well, as you know, I'm all about rethinking the polarity of the knife and cup thing. So
Yeah.
yes.
Yep, good times. And I'm still banging away at the blog, and need to get a piece published there actually soon, before my editor starts giving me long, mournful looks, and then I feel bad and tears.
Yeah, he does look terribly cute when he does that, though.
It's true. It's true. He does. I just want to cuddle him.
Yes,
But of course
he's
we
adorable.
can't. His pandemic. Oh, he is.
Yes.
He's freaking adorable. But yeah, that's kind of what I've got on right now.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. This has been a really great interview. and I really enjoyed doing it and hearing about all your stuff. Fantastic.